The first game update focusing on original Trilogy content arrives into Star Wars Battlefront 2 in less than 2 weeks. And if you've been a regular viewer of the channel or watch my live streams, then you'll know there is unfortunately a very good chance this update won't live up to its full potential. Why, you ask? Well, these feelings mainly come at the result of DICE announcing that unlike the prequel or sequel trilogies, which have a capital ship phase and capital supremacy mode, that the original trilogy would not have a capital ship phase at all. As a result of DICE cutting content from the original trilogy, they've earlier this month officially renamed the mode from capital supremacy to just supremacy. DICE's reasoning for this is because since they'll be using maps such as Death Star 2 and Scarif, that a capital ship phase wouldn't make sense to do, despite of course ignoring the 5-6 other original trilogy maps that would have no issues in having a capital ship phase. To me, this is very evident that DICE aren't willing to put in the time, effort, and care into making the original trilogy season be the best it can be, or at the very least offer the same equal amount of content that the prequel and sequel era supremacy modes currently do. Instead, the sad truth is that all DICE care about is wanting to rush through the original trilogy as quickly as possible, just so they can get back to working on the Clone Wars again. And while I would love to see more Clone Wars content come to the game as much as the next person, at the same time it does disappoint me as an original trilogy fan first and foremost. Let's take a look back first on the sequel trilogy, which, believe it or not, was rushed itself. Of course, it wasn't as blatant of a rush job like the original trilogy will be, but more so a case of DICE cutting corners here and there to slowly ease and transition everyone to what they'll eventually be doing. So when we do get to the original trilogy, then there won't be any outrage, or at least that's what DICE's plan is. But you're probably asking, what did DICE exactly rush with the sequel trilogy? It's got a capital ship phase unlike the original trilogy, so what's the issue? Well, that's just it. When we compare the capital ship phase of the sequel era to the prequel era supremacy mode, then we can really see what a rush job it was. For starters, the sequel era capital ship phase doesn't even have boarding cinematics. Now, apparently DICE at first said that this was a glitch, but since releasing their recent patch this week, this so-called glitch was not even corrected or acknowledged, making it seem that these boarding cinematics don't even exist at all, and it might just be the case of DICE hoping everyone forgets about it and stops asking. Personally, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and wait until the original trilogy update comes out and decide then. As who knows, they might put a fix for this there. But if they don't by then, it's going to be pretty obvious those cinematics never existed to begin with. Next, let's take a look at the hangar phase during the capital ship takedown, which is always one of my favorite parts to play in the prequel era supremacy mode. And, well, hangars simply don't even exist in the sequel era supremacy mode when in the capital ship phase. Instead, the game ignores hangars altogether and puts everyone already magically in the middle of the ship, which itself is very strange as we know the First Order Star Destroyer and MC-85 hangars are definitely large enough to handle supremacy mode. I mean, the First Order Star Destroyer hangar by itself is visually amazing to look at, and it's such a bummer for DICE to completely ignore it. But then again, if these hangars don't exist, then it definitely makes sense on why the boarding cinematics, which obviously involve the hangars, are mysteriously missing too. Just saying. This leads to my next point, the size of the capital ship interiors in the sequel era. Get this, both of them are smaller in size than the Republic Venator or the Separatist Dreadnought, especially with the MC-85 having the smallest map of them all. Which is actually laughable when you think about it because canonically the MC-85 is the largest capital ship in the entire game. Like, the Venator and the Dreadnought are basically baby food compared to it, and yet somehow, someway, the largest ship in the game gets the smallest map. Makes absolutely no sense at all and just shows DICE's clear bias here towards Clone Wars content only. Heck, let's take a look at the ground phase now on Age and Claws, where DICE decided to take the easy route and give both factions an AT-ST and First Order snowspeeders. And listen, I get the Resistance using stolen snowspeeders on Starkiller Base, but Age and Claws? The First Order is attacking the Resistance base on Agen Class, so it only makes sense the Resistance should be using their own speeders on this map, like the Geon 211 Patrol Speeder, which is the Resistance's canon speeder as seen in The Force Awakens. But nope, instead of creating new assets, DICE simply took the easy route here and copy and pasted the First Order Snowspeeder. So as a result, we have First Order Snowspeeders fighting against First Order Snowspeeders. Great. Then of course we have the so-called stolen ATST that the Resistance use, which also doesn't make sense. Shouldn't it be called scavenged ATST, not stolen? Because how can the Resistance steal an Imperial ATST when by the time the Resistance faction was born, the Galactic Empire hadn't even existed for years upon years? Not just that, but I mean, at least give the ATST a proper unique skin. Make it look aged, battle-worn, and maybe throw a rebel crest on it somewhere. Like for example, take a look at the Raider ATST in The Mandalorian. That show takes place 5 years after Return of the Jedi, and look at the rough state that ATST is in. Yet the Battle of Agen Class in Battlefront 2 is supposed to take place 31 years after the Return of the Jedi, so why does the Imperial ATST somehow look squeaky clean and pretty much brand new? Again, another lazy copy and paste in order to rush out the sequel trilogy. Oh, and last but not least, if you take a look up in the skies during the sequel era Supremacy mode, then I kid you not, you'll be seeing Clone Wars ships flying in the skies on Takodana and Jakku, with the exception of Agen Class, which funny enough uses the original trilogy T-65 X-Wing instead of the sequel trilogy T-70 X-Wing. But hey, DICE probably didn't think anyone was gonna look at the sky anyway, right? So as we can see, while sequel era Supremacy isn't a full rush job like original trilogy Supremacy will be, the signs are certainly there for DICE cutting corners any way they possibly could, which unfortunately doesn't bode well and give me much confidence that they'll do the original trilogy justice. It's very apparent they want to take the easy way out by even including Death Star 2 as a map in Supremacy, just so they'll have an excuse to not add a capital ship phase. Even though they deliberately avoided using Starkiller Base for sequel era Supremacy just so they could have a capital ship phase. Now I ask you, out of all the original trilogy maps in the game, why pick the one map that restricts a capital ship phase from ever needing to happen? You don't do that unless you need an excuse not to make a certain mode or something. As for Scarif, DICE could technically had added a capital ship phase for that map too. They could just say the battle takes place before the shield gate closes or even after the shield gate is destroyed. And the whole, well, they can't do that because it wouldn't be canon excuse has been thrown out the window at this point too. Especially with DICE fabricating a fantasy battle on Agen Class that never existed in canon, and having Sith Troopers fight alongside the First Order too. So come on DICE, if you're going to ignore canon in multiplayer, then at least stay consistent about it, rather than flip-flopping around from canon to non-canon back and forth to whatever requires less work or is more convenient. Now, as I stated in a previous video, there are currently 10 original trilogy planets in the game. Tatooine, Endor, Death Star 2, Kessel, Sullust, Bespin, Pilio, Vardos, Yavin 4, and Hoth. And only one of those 10, being the Death Star 2, is where a capital ship phase wouldn't work. So why not just do what they did with Starkiller Base in the sequel era and ignore Death Star 2 completely here? Because sacrificing the potential of all those planets for one just not to have a capital ship phase is a cheap move in my opinion. I believe I also heard DICE use the excuse as well by saying that capital ship battles were rare in the original trilogy era or that rebels never boarded a Star Destroyer, which again, that itself is laughable. When in both canon and legends, the rebels boarded Imperial ships plenty of times and even stole Imperial Star Destroyers on several occasions too. As for capital ship battles, Rogue One features the best cinematic capital ship battle out of any Star Wars movie. And we always see Imperial and Rebel capital ships duke it out in the skies on Battlefront maps, such as Sullust, Hoth, among many others. So it's definitely sad to see DICE stubbornly ignore all of this just to give us the bare minimum here. which is why I'm going to go into the next update with low expectations. Now, there's also the question to be asked, should the Rebel Alliance get a proper vehicle to use in Supremacy mode? Like for example the Rebel Combat Speeder, which was seen in Hoth in Empire Strikes Back. Or better yet, the T-2B repulsor tank, which is also canon. And yes, DICE should definitely do that, as let's not forget, they did give the Republic a new vehicle in Capital Supremacy. So is the original trilogy any worse? Well, from everything we've seen thus far, then apparently in their eyes it is. So knowing that and seeing DICE cutting corners already with the sequel era, I'm pretty sure we're just gonna see the Rebels get nothing but a copy and pasted AT-RT again, or maybe, if we're lucky, a copy and pasted AT-ST. Oh joy. Now, am I being nitpicky here? Yeah, for sure. I'm always nitpicky when it comes to Star Wars. That's just the type of person I am, and I don't hide that. At the same time, me being nitpicky here doesn't disqualify my reasons here for DICE wanting to rush through the upcoming original trilogy season content. The point of this video was simply to inform people and temper their expectations. I'm still going to go into the original trilogy content excited as ever. But at the same time, at the back of my head, I'll know we could have had so much better than what will be delivered. N7 from Silo signing off.